Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving deep into the insights of Dr. Julie Smith.
Yeah, she's a clinical psychologist who's made a real name for herself online.
And our source for this is her conversation on the Diary of a CEO.
Right.
And what we're really going to dig into are her most helpful ideas about, dealing with overthinking, managing anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
understanding like why we humans do what we do,
Oh, yeah,
and ultimately how to create a life that feels really meaningful.
absolutely.
And, what you're looking for here are those key takeaways. You don't want to get bogged down in all the little details.
Exactly.
So let's just jump right into it.
So one of the things that really jumped out at me from Dr. Smith's conversation
Yeah.
was how her understanding of people has evolved over time.
Interesting.
The interviewer started off with this assumption that everyone is so fundamentally different.
Right.
But actually, through his experience with all these interviews, and Dr. Smith echoes this from her work as a therapist, there's actually a pattern that emerges. Humans are actually surprisingly predictable
Okay.
in many of our core reactions.
Right. So she put it like, if you poke it like this, typically like X, Y, or Z will happen.
Yeah, exactly. And it's such a powerful idea, isn't it?
It is.
That underneath all these kind of individual complexities that we have,
Yeah.
there is this sort of foundational level of just predictable human response.
Right. Right.
So what's the key insight there for you?
Well, I think the key insight is that this predictability is what allows therapies and psychological models to even exist.
Exactly.
Because clinicians are seeing these patterns in how people respond to certain situations.
Exactly.
Stress is right.
Mm-hmm.
And that helps us to understand and address that distress.
Totally. And I think what's important here is that Dr. Smith is careful to balance this, right?
Yeah.
She says individuals will always have unique aspects
Of course.
to their stories and their ways of coping.
Right.
So we can see trends.
Right.
But we can't make these absolute assumptions
Yeah.
about any one person.
Absolutely. And that makes her journey to becoming a TikTok sensation all the more fascinating.
It is.
Because it's certainly not the typical path, right?
Yeah, no, it's not.
For a clinical psychologist to go from working in this very private one-on-one setting to then having this huge online presence. So what sparked that move?
So her motivation, it wasn't like a personal crisis or a desire for fame.
Okay.
It was this growing sense of frustration.
Okay.
That she realized that these valuable life skills and these insights that she was sharing in the therapy room were just not accessible
Of course, yeah.
to the vast majority of people who could actually benefit from them.
Right.
So it was really wanting to democratize that knowledge. That was her driving force.
Right. And her husband seems to have played a pretty significant role in that. Because she talked about how he suggested that she should try putting content online.
Yeah.
Which led to her, now humorous recollection of this really rubbish YouTube video that she made.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there was the unexpected jump to TikTok.
Right.
Which initially she was very skeptical about.
Oh, completely, yeah.
Because in her mind, it was just this platform for 16-year-old kids dancing.
Totally.
And not really a space for serious, mental health education. So what was her initial reaction?
So she admitted to being really hesitant at first and even anticipating some negative reactions or being dismissed because, the platform just didn't seem geared towards this type of content.
Yeah.
But the fascinating thing is that the response was almost immediate.
Really?
And overwhelmingly positive.
Wow.
And this totally took her by surprise.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the Gen Z audience that she'd imagined.
Yeah.
She talked about getting messages from parents, even grandparents.
I know.
Who were finding her explanations really helpful.
Yeah.
And they were sharing them with their families.
Yeah.
So what does that tell us?
Well, I think it highlights this huge unmet need, right? And this widespread desire for accessible and evidence-based information about mental health. And it's across all generations.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think it's important to note that while she has this massive online reach now, she still does see a small number of individual clients.
Oh, okay.
Although, obviously, with the demands of content creation and writing, that has limited her ability to take on new patients. So I think it speaks to that tension, right?
Yeah.
Between the impact of broader reach versus that depth of individual connection that you get in therapy.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act, isn't it?
It is, and it must be such a significant adjustment. You know, to go from the relative privacy of one-on-one sessions to this, like, constant visibility and feedback from millions of people online.
Millions, yeah.
And especially for someone who identifies as an introvert.
Right.
I mean, that's a huge shift in environment and energy.
Absolutely. And she talked about actually employing those very strategies that she teaches.
Yes.
Like pushing herself outside of her comfort zone.
Exactly.
Because she believes in the value of making this information more widely available.
Yeah.
So that act of embracing discomfort for a valued cause is a real key insight, I think.
Absolutely. And one thing she mentioned that really resonated with me was this idea of the mental filter.
Okay.
It's this almost automatic tendency, you know, where we zoom in on the negative feedback.
Oh, yeah.
Even when we're surrounded by loads of positive comments.
I know. I'm so guilty of that.
Me too, yeah.
Yeah.
And she gave the example of sifting through hundreds of positive messages just to find that one neutral one.
Yeah, or even just slightly critical, and it just ruins your whole day.
I know. Why do we do that?
Well, she gave a really interesting explanation for it, actually.
Okay.
Which is that, essentially, our brains are often wired to prioritize perceived threats.
Oh, interesting.
Even when we're surrounded by positivity.
Okay.
And this likely has evolutionary roots.
Yeah, I see.
Because being attuned to potential dangers or social rejection was, like, crucial for survival back in the day.
Right. Back when we were, like, cavemen.
Exactly. Like that feeling of not being accepted by the tribe could literally mean death.
Wow. Yeah.
So it makes sense that even now, that feeling of rejection, even online, can still trigger that deep-seated response in us.
And I think it was interesting, you know, she made this point that, like, this feeling often precedes the rational thought.
Yes.
Right? It's like a gut reaction.
Totally. Your body can be reacting to that perceived rejection before your brain has even had time to process it.
Oh, that's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to emphasize here that she wasn't saying, like, you know, we need to become immune to negative feelings.
Of course not.
Or just pretend that they don't matter.
Yeah.
It's more about developing a healthier way of managing those thoughts and emotional responses when they do inevitably arise.
Totally.
And that brings us to this idea of, like, the stories we tell ourselves about rejection.
Oh, yes. And I love the analogy she used for this.
What was that?
Romantic rejection.
Okay, yeah.
So she said that the real pain often comes not from the separation itself, but from the negative narrative that we construct afterwards. Things like, I'm not good enough, or I'm unlovable.
Right.
It's that story that really hurts.
So how do those stories develop?
Well, these narratives often tap into something called our core beliefs. And these are basically like the deeply ingrained and often unconscious assumptions that we hold about ourselves, about others, and about the world in general.
Okay.
And these beliefs, they usually start forming really early in childhood.
Right.
Based on our experiences and our interactions with, like, our primary caregivers.
Okay.
So, for example, a child who experiences, you know, inconsistent care might develop a core belief of, I'm unworthy of love.
I see.
Or, you know, people can't be trusted.
Wow, yeah.
Things like that.
Okay.
And to kind of protect ourselves from the pain of these core beliefs, we develop what she calls rules for living.
Okay, so how do those work?
So, think about it like this. If our core beliefs are the foundation of a house, the rules for living are kind of like the furniture arrangement.
Right.
You hope it will keep the foundation hidden and protected.
Gotcha.
So these are often like unconscious strategies we develop. Like, if I'm always perfect, no one will reject me.
I see.
Or if I always please others, they'll love me.
Right.
But the problem is these rules are often very rigid and unsustainable in, like, the complexities of real life.
Yeah, they don't always work.
No.
So what happens then?
Okay, so when we inevitably can't live up to these rules, or there are signs that they might fail, that's when the underlying core belief gets triggered.
Okay.
And this leads to, like, you know, feelings of anxiety, sadness, anger, other forms of psychological distress.
Right.
So life inevitably throws a curveball, right?
Yeah.
And we can't perfectly adhere to our rule for living. Say, for example, we make a mistake. Despite our rule of always being perfect, that discrepancy, it's like a trigger.
Okay.
It activates the underlying fear associated with our core belief.
Right.
Like, I'm not good enough.
Gotcha.
The C.
And she mentioned something called CCAT, cognitive analytic therapy.
Yes.
What's the core idea behind that?
So ADA focuses on understanding how those early relationship patterns that we talk about can actually create recurring scripts in our adult lives.
Wow.
And it helps you to identify those scripts and rewrite them.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it looks specifically at how our early interactions shape those core beliefs and the coping mechanisms, those rules for living that we develop as a result.
Right.
And, sometimes those childhood survival strategies.
Things that help us as kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They become unhelpful or even damaging in our adult relationships.
Interesting. It's fascinating how those early patterns really stick with us.
They do.
And Dr. Smith emphasized that changing these ingrained habits isn't just a matter of willpower.
No, absolutely not.
It actually requires a process of recognizing the cycle first.
Yeah.
Maybe looking back at past events, seeing that pattern, and then, with practice, starting to notice it in the moment.
That's the key. That moment of in-the-moment awareness is crucial.
Totally, yeah.
Because once you start to recognize that familiar pattern of thought, feeling, and behavior, you then have the opportunity to make a different choice. Even though, it can be incredibly challenging.
Of course.
To break free from those deeply ingrained responses.
Yeah.
It's a process.
Yeah, absolutely.
It takes time.
So, for those of us who don't have access to GAT therapy, are there things that we can do on our own?
Yes.
To kind of start to gain some of that self-awareness around these patterns?
Yeah, Dr. Smith suggests things like journaling, reflecting on your experiences.
Right.
And particularly looking for recurring themes or patterns in your behavior and your relationships.
Gotcha.
And, writing things down, it gives you that valuable outside perspective that can help you to see the cycle more clearly.
Okay, yeah.
So you're tracking what happens in certain situations, how you felt, how others reacted.
Yeah.
You can start to identify those repeating narratives and triggers.
I see. And she also made the really important point that identifying the pattern is one thing, but knowing how to actually change it can be the real challenge.
It is, yeah.
And sometimes, getting an outside opinion from a trusted friend can be helpful to kind of check our perceptions when we're too in it.
Absolutely.
But she cautioned that, this isn't necessarily a substitute for professional support.
No.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the unique psychological pressures that come with having a large online presence.
Yeah.
Because Dr. Smith talked about dealing with imposter syndrome and the inevitable accusations of just being lucky.
Right, which are never fun to hear.
So how did she address those?
So I loved her response to the lucky comment.
What was it?
She said, lucky's pretty hard work, isn't it? And I think that's so true.
It is.
She acknowledged that, there were external factors, like the pandemic, increasing online engagement, that played a role.
Yeah.
But she also highlighted the very personal challenges, right?
Of course.
Of being so visible, especially as an introvert.
Yeah, and putting yourself out there all the time.
Yeah.
Creating content.
Yeah, it takes a lot of dedication.
It really does.
And juggling family life on top of that.
Right.
It's a lot.
It is. And it's a good reminder, I think, that success rarely happens without significant effort.
I agree.
And then, of course, there's the increased public scrutiny.
Yeah.
Which she admitted that, there were times when she questioned whether this level of public exposure was something that she truly desired.
Right.
Especially with, the potential for negative and sometimes unfounded media attention.
Yeah, it's a lot to deal with.
It is. And it brings up this really interesting question of do you step back from something that you believe is valuable and has a positive impact in order to protect your own privacy and well-being?
Absolutely.
And it's a tension that she clearly navigates.
She does.
Balancing that sense of purpose with her own personal needs and the needs of her family.
And I think it ties into this broader cultural narrative that we often have, right?
Yeah.
About constantly striving for these extraordinary achievements, standing out from the crowd, being the best.
Yeah.
Dr. Smith raises a really important point.
What was that?
She suggests that it's perfectly okay to desire a quieter, more private life, even though that's not always validated or celebrated
by
society.
Yeah.
And it's something that we, I think, need to really think about.
We do. And ultimately, it comes back to those values, right?
Absolutely.
Aligning with your own personal values. Regularly checking in with yourself about how you want to live, and then making choices that reflect those values.
Absolutely.
But recognizing, too, that those choices can evolve over time.
Right. They're not static.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Smith's family, they act as this kind of crucial touchstone for her.
I see.
She's continually assessing how her public work is impacting her children.
Right.
And she uses that as the primary guide for her decisions and boundaries.
Yeah. And that leads us nicely to her discussion about values versus goals.
Yes.
How did she differentiate between those two?
So she explained that goals are typically like finite achievements.
Okay.
You reach them and then they're completed.
Gotcha.
Values, on the other hand, are more like a continuous direction.
Okay.
It's a path that you choose to walk throughout your life.
I see.
They're about how you want to be and how you want to act consistently.
So if life kind of pulls you off course, how do your values help you get back on track?
So think about life as a journey.
Okay.
And your values are like the compass guiding you.
I like that.
You're going to encounter detours. You're going to encounter distractions.
Absolutely.
But having that clear understanding of your values, it allows you to recognize when you've strayed too far from what's truly important to you.
Yeah. Okay.
And it gives you a direction to kind of course correct.
Gotcha. And she suggested doing regular values check-ins. So what does that involve?
So she recommends looking at different key areas of your life.
Okay.
So, things like family, relationships, health, career, personal growth.
Right, the big ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And identifying how you want to be in those areas.
Okay.
It's about your attitude, your intentions, the qualities you want to embody.
Okay.
So, for example, in your career, do you value like creativity, collaboration, making a significant impact?
Yeah.
What are those things for you?
So it's not about like the specific achievements. It's more about like the kind of person you want to be in those roles.
Yeah.
How do you then use that information?
So once you've identified your core values, you can then assess how well your current actions and behaviors align with those values.
Okay.
So Dr. Smith suggests like rating both the importance of each value to you and how well you feel you're currently living in accordance with it.
Okay.
And this comparison can really highlight areas where there's a significant gap.
Right. So those are the areas that you want to focus on.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. That's a really helpful exercise.
And then she also touched on this distinction between like true values and desires that might be driven by like underlying insecurities.
Okay, how do you tell the difference?
I know, it's tricky, isn't it?
It is.
So, this can be a real process of self-discovery. We might initially think we value something like material wealth.
Okay.
But upon deeper reflection, we realize that that desire might actually stem from like a childhood insecurity about not having enough.
Right.
True values, they tend to be more intrinsically rewarding and aligned with a deeper sense of purpose.
Yeah.
And Dr. Smith points out that our understanding of our values can evolve as we gain more life experience and self-awareness.
Of course.
So what seemed important at one stage of life might shift significantly.
Yeah, as we mature.
Yeah.
Which kind of reinforces the importance of those regular values check-ins, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing process
of
self-reflection and aligning our lives with what truly matters to us at our core.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And speaking of change, Dr. Smith emphasized that, like, meaningful personal growth, it rarely happens through those sudden dramatic shifts.
Right.
So what's her perspective on the nature of change?
So she really highlights that sustainable change is typically a very gradual process.
Okay.
And it involves consistent reflection and small, manageable actions.
Okay.
Rather than trying to like overhaul everything at once.
Yeah.
We often underestimate the cumulative power of those small incremental improvements.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the development of positive habits over time.
Yeah, it's about consistency.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And being willing to adapt along the way.
Exactly.
And now we all have those days when our mood just tanks.
We do.
And Dr. Smith talked about managing those bad days.
Yes.
And that really interesting connection between our mood, our decisions, and our behavior. So what were some of her key points there?
So one crucial point that she made is that you can't always simply reason your way out of a bad mood.
Okay.
Sometimes trying to analyze it too much can actually make it worse.
I feel that.
And she really emphasizes this powerful influence of the body on the mind.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So what kind of, like, physical interventions
Yeah.
can actually help to shift a bad mood?
She mentioned things like exercise, listening to uplifting music,
Right.
even the act of singing, or changing your posture.
Okay.
These can all have a positive impact. And crucially, human connection.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Reaching out to someone, that can also be a very effective mood booster.
Right, right.
So it's about finding what works for you personally in those moments, but having like a little toolkit.
Right, that you can just go to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the importance of sleep.
Oh, yeah. The often overlooked importance of sleep.
I know, right?
And she was quite firm on that, wasn't she?
She was.
Yeah.
She stressed that, like, adequate sleep is foundational for our mood and overall well-being.
Right.
And she really pushed back against that whole sleep when you die mentality.
Yeah.
You know, she emphasized that, like, consistently sacrificing sleep, it significantly impairs our emotional regulation and our cognitive function.
So it's not a luxury.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's a necessity.
Prioritizing sleep is a necessity.
Absolutely.
For good mental and physical health.
Well, I agree.
Okay. And Dr. Smith also delved into the topic of motivation and how it can change when an activity transitions from being intrinsically rewarding to extrinsically motivated, like when a hobby becomes a job.
Yeah.
What are the implications of that?
Well, there's a risk that, you know, the initial enjoyment and that internal drive, it can decrease when those external rewards, like money or recognition, become the primary focus.
Right.
So that's why it's so vital to stay connected to your original why.
I see.
Right.
So, like, the underlying values and reasons that got you into it in the first place.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Reconnecting with that intrinsic motivation can help to sustain you through those challenges and those external pressures.
Yeah, yeah. And she also pointed out that, like, feeling overwhelmed can really kill motivation.
It can.
Especially when we're striving for these unrealistic ideals.
Yeah.
And she reminded us that motivation itself is a feeling that kind of comes and goes.
It does.
You can't always rely on it.
Absolutely not.
To keep you going.
Yeah.
So what do you rely on instead?
Your values.
Right, right.
So even when motivation dips, those deeply held values, they can act as like an anchor.
Okay.
Guiding our actions and helping us to persevere.
Okay.
Towards what we believe is truly important.
Yeah, it's about acting in alignment with those values.
Yeah.